What if the conflicts you see today didn't actually start in the last decade, but were quietly engineered over 100 years ago? Not through battles but through decisions, borders, and broken promises. Today, we're counting down from number 10 to number 1, uncovering the hidden moments that still shape global tensions in 2026. And by the time we reach number 1, you'll realize something unsettling: some conflicts were never meant to end. Let's start at number 10, because this is where the pattern begins. In 1920, Iraq exploded into revolt against British rule. What makes this moment so powerful isn't just the uprising, it's who joined it. Sunni and Shia communities, tribal groups, all united for one reason: resisting foreign control. That unity reveals something most people miss. The instability we see today didn't come from internal chaos. It came from systems imposed from the outside. Now think about that for a second. Imagine if a foreign power suddenly took control of parts of the United States and expected everyone to just accept it. That tension wouldn't disappear, it would build. And that brings us to number 9, where the first real fracture begins. During World War I, Britain promised Arab leaders independence if they helped defeat the Ottoman Empire. But after the war ended, those promises vanished. And here's the problem with broken promises at that scale: they don't just disappear. They echo. Every future negotiation, every alliance, every political decision becomes influenced by that memory of betrayal. Trust isn't just damaged, it's rewritten. And once that happens, cooperation becomes fragile. Now here's where things take a dramatic turn. At number 8, we get the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Two European powers sat down and drew lines across the Middle East, dividing it into zones of influence. On paper, it looked clean and organized. In reality, it ignored everything that actually mattered: culture, language, religion, history. Entire communities were split apart, while others were forced into the same borders despite long-standing tensions. Let me put that into perspective. Imagine redrawing the map of the U.S. by slicing through states randomly, combining California with parts of Nevada and Arizona, then splitting Texas in half. No one would expect that system to work. But that's essentially what happened here. And those borders still exist today, quietly shaping conflicts more than a century later. So now ask yourself, what happens when you build countries on foundations that were never stable? That's exactly what number 7 answers. Many modern states in the region weren't formed naturally. They were constructed. Different ethnic groups, religious identities, and tribes were placed under one system and expected to function as a single nation. And while that might hold temporarily, it creates long-term tension. Because identity doesn't disappear just because a border exists. Over time, those hidden pressures begin to surface, especially when power structures weaken or leadership changes. And here's the uncomfortable truth: when identity and politics collide, conflicts become much harder to solve. That leads us directly to number 6, and this is where history goes even deeper. The divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims began over 1,300 years ago as a disagreement about leadership. But over time, that difference evolved into something much larger. Today, it influences alliances between countries, shapes governments, and plays a role in regional power struggles. In some cases, it even determines foreign policy decisions and military alignments. But here's the key insight. This isn't just about religion anymore. It's about influence, power, strategy, an ancient disagreement that has been pulled into modern geopolitics again and again. And every time it's used in that context, it becomes more complex. What started as a succession issue has now transformed into a tool that can be used, amplified, or even manipulated depending on the situation. Now let's fast forward, because history doesn't stay still, it compounds. At number 5, we have the Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980. This wasn't a sudden conflict. It was the result of years of tension over territory, politics, and influence. The war lasted 8 years and caused an estimated 500,000 to over 1 million casualties. But here's what makes it truly important: the war didn't solve anything. It ended without a clear resolution, leaving both sides exhausted but still divided. Entire cities were destroyed, economies were drained, and yet the core issues remained untouched, quietly waiting beneath the surface. And when conflicts end without resolution, they don't really end. They pause. Think of it like hitting pause on a movie halfway through. The story isn't finished, it's just waiting to continue. And that's exactly what happened here. The tension didn't disappear, it adapted, influencing future decisions, alliances, and rivalries in ways that weren't always obvious at first. And when the conditions were right again, those same tensions found new ways to reappear. Now combine that unresolved tension with economic pressure, and you get number 4. After the war, Iraq was heavily in debt, owing tens of billions of dollars. At the same time, oil prices were dropping, partly due to increased production by neighboring countries like Kuwait. Iraq saw this as a direct threat to its recovery. And in 1990, that pressure reached a breaking point. Iraq invaded Kuwait. It was a decision driven by urgency, frustration, and a belief that control over resources could reset the country's position. This wasn't driven by ideology. It was driven by economics mixed with power. And that decision triggered the Gulf War, pulling the United States into the region in a major way. Once that happened, the dynamics changed permanently. Because when a global superpower enters a regional conflict, it doesn't just influence the outcome, it reshapes the entire system. Military presence, alliances, and long-term strategies begin to evolve, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond the original conflict. Now here's where things start to feel very familiar. At number 3, we reach the Iraq War in 2003. The initial objective was clear: eliminate weapons of mass destruction. But those weapons were never found. And when the original goal disappears, something dangerous happens. The mission starts to shift. First it becomes about removing leadership, then about rebuilding the country. And each shift adds complexity, making the situation harder to control and predict. And this is where conflicts begin to stretch beyond control. Because when objectives keep changing, success becomes impossible to define. And if you can't define success, you can't end the conflict. It just continues, evolving into something else. What starts as a military operation slowly turns into a long-term engagement, where the original purpose becomes harder to recognize over time. Now here's the consequence most people don't fully connect. At number 2, we see the result of that instability: a power vacuum. When the existing system in Iraq collapsed, there was no strong structure to replace it. Different groups competed for control. And in that chaos, more extreme organizations were able to rise. This environment contributed to the emergence of ISIS, which quickly became a global concern. Entire regions fell under its control at one point, demonstrating how quickly instability can escalate when no clear authority exists. Think about that for a second. A war intended to stabilize a region ended up creating conditions for even greater instability. That's not just a mistake, it's a chain reaction. One decision leads to another, and before long, the consequences grow far beyond what anyone originally expected. And now we arrive at number 1, the idea that ties everything together. The real reason conflicts don't clearly end. It's not just about history, borders, or ideology. It's about something much simpler: unclear objectives. When a conflict begins with one goal and shifts into another, it becomes impossible to define what winning actually means. And without that clarity, strategies become inconsistent, and outcomes become unpredictable. And if no one agrees on what victory looks like, the conflict never truly ends. It just changes form. It moves from military to political, from political to economic, from economic to ideological. But it never fully disappears. Instead, it adapts to new conditions, continuing in ways that may look different but are connected to the same unresolved issues. And once you see that pattern, everything starts to make sense. These aren't isolated events. They're connected. Each decision leads to another, each conflict builds on the last, creating a system that keeps repeating itself. And that cycle continues until the root causes are addressed, not just the surface-level symptoms. So the next time you see a conflict on the news, don't just look at what's happening now. Ask a different question: where did this really begin? Because the answer is almost never recent. And that's the part most people never think about. If this video completely changed the way you see global events, you're in the right place, because we break down complex history into stories that actually make sense. And if you want to be smarter every day, like and subscribe.